now request Ambassador Ponappa to deliver the speech.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Nias, for inviting me to join this discussion on a subject which is obviously not just of academic interest, but I think very closely linked with the kind of strategic discourse that each one of us is involved with and is trying to give some shape to in terms of the kind of decision making that we are able to influence, contribute to in any way that we can. I feel that in a way what I have to say could be like the kind of very standard two-liner answer to Parliament questions that those of us who've been in government have sometimes had the pleasure of putting up to our political masters, where A of the question is either no sir or yes sir, and B is does not arise. Because I think so much has been said that I'm not going to try to pretend to add to the analytical part of the discourse, but to try in a freewheeling kind of manner to pull together much of what we have talked about through the day and see whether I can build on what Professor Muni has, as always, very succinctly put down. I'm going to start with a few general areas that we need to look at. They might have been touched on in the course of the discussion, but I think they might be worth repeating. I will then apply some of those issues to India's thinking on the subject, and finally try to address the specific questions that have been put down in the concept paper for this session. When Ambassador Ranganathan made his opening remarks this morning, I noted that he had really expanded the discourse in terms of what Asia or the Asia-Pacific constituted. And I do believe this becomes relevant because while on the one hand one might think one is discussing the nuclear problem in the northeastern part of the Korean Peninsula, accepting that suddenly that has a direct impact in our northwestern neighborhood because of the kind of proliferation that North Korea and China might have undertaken with regard to transfer of know-how on missiles and nuclear weaponry. Likewise, whether it is Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific. Now, China has, for reasons best known to it, already opposed the concept of the Indo-Pacific because they see it possibly as India-Pacific. Other countries have said that the Indian Ocean does not mean that it is India's ocean. Some of us have pointed out that the Indo-Pacific could mean a reference obviously to India, because that is the defining use of the adjective. It could be a reference to the Indian Ocean. It could even be a reference to Indonesia, which I think is, as part of our discussion, extremely underrated in terms of its immense strategic expanse, ranging from the Bay of Bengal all the way into the Pacific Ocean. And then we had the reference to Eurasia. And if we are talking perhaps of China's hunt for resources and the China-Iran hydrocarbon relationship, and then you have the Iranian connection with the Caucasus and Central Asia, we have the Russian interest in what's going on, not just with China, but also in the Pacific. And then finally you have this term of South Asia, which I think when it first appeared in terms of active diplomatic and political discourse in the 1980s, leading up eventually to the establishment of SAARC, in my view, sought to lock India into 6 of its 11 neighbors. At some stage, if we can get into that at a later stage. But the bottom line is, What shall India's worldview be? Where do we wish to position ourselves? Because depending on that will emerge the kind of positions that we take, the options that we have. Clearly, there are overlapping domains. If you're talking about the SCO, we are there as observers still, currently. We have had our own reservations about becoming full members. ARF, the whole engagement with ASEAN took time to fall into place. EAS, we were in on the ground floor, as Hemant mentioned. And we have active security dialogue, say, with a body like the Gulf Cooperation Council as well. This morning we heard, I think, Ambassador Ranganathan talking about how China has leveraged its geography. And since we don't have a map over here, just try to visualize the range that India has in terms of its geographical spread in all directions. And if you were to start from east to west, obviously it would encompass China, it would encompass Central Asia, it would encompass the Gulf, the Indian Ocean, including and Antarctica. And these are things that hydrographers decide on. So whether you call it the Southern Ocean or Antarctic Ocean or whatever else, it's really part of the same set. The Bay of Bengal as a separate subset, because I think it has been heating up over the past decade, and that is quite evident now. Myanmar, which for long years was considered a lonely outpost, which only India and China and some Southeast Asian countries were involved in, but has suddenly become the flavor of the month, somewhat, I might add, to the chagrin of the Myanmaris. Maritime issues, again, which have suddenly been discovered, even though I think to this day after independence, India remains a sea-locked country. We have no exit by land as matters presently stand. What about the Pacific? Do we have a natural engagement with the Pacific which we should be pursuing? You could say that of the Atlantic and the Mediterranean as well. Or closer home to the Gulf of Thailand, which, like the Andaman Sea, is somewhat outside our mindset. So we've got to think in terms of how geography affects us as well, including something as basic as the fact that while we talk of a north-south corridor to Russia, through Iran, across the Caspian Sea and into Russia, the bulk of our trade still goes in through Rotterdam, oddly enough. So the mindset will determine how we view this. A second factor that comes into play is the American role. Now, much has been said about it. I would just like to add a few points. Is the United States an Asian power? It doesn't sound as absurd as it might appear to be, because the fact of the matter is that the history of the development of the United States, going back to the 18th century onwards, has been, without any value judgment attached to it, an expansionist one. They have expanded to the west, they have expanded to the south. Your continental United States moved into Alaska, has moved into Hawaii, and today the dilemma perhaps for the United States is what is the kind of engagement they need to have in Asia. As much as Hawaii was incorporated in 1958, I believe, and that had huge implications for the reach of United States maritime interests across the Pacific, in terms of really systematizing what they fought for in World War II. At some stage, Guam is going to come into play. The whole range of the US interests in Micronesia is going to come into play. And that too is something that we need to bear in mind. And the United States has kept returning to Asia in different ways. You had the colonial rule over the Philippines. You had the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, which they had to wind up. Vietnam was very clearly a blunder. Today, you have the Americans ultimately being admitted into the East Asia Summit. And you have the ongoing emergence of the relationships that may or may not emerge between the TPP as an American initiative and the RECA. Now, how this is going to work itself out, whether in terms of purely trade or strategic engagement, still remains to be seen. Other great changes that are likely center around the SCO. There's been some discussion of that, but I found no mention of the CSTO, which Russia continues to control as its own version of a Central Asian NATO, even to the exclusion of China. So there is something which seeks to play a role over there as well. The emerging dynamics within the Gulf and West Asia. Syria seems a long way off, but if you talk of the growth of the units of Al-Qaeda and other such groupings within Syria, I think the ramifications would really extend all the way across Asia. The opening of the Northern Passage, should it impact on us? Because if China has sent as many expeditions as it has, the admirals can correct me, I think it's 8 thus far, plus now they have commercial traffic through. I beg your pardon? They've already sent 16 expeditions, okay. And they also have commercial traffic going through it. Is this something that India needs to be involved with? We are now observers in the Arctic Council, thanks to a few Scandinavian friends. How are we going to leverage that? And the growth of the Chinese Navy, not just in terms of their nuclear submarines or whether they are fighting Somali pirates, but again, their worldview in terms of where the Indian Ocean and the waters of the East China Sea, the South China Sea, fit into what they consider their legitimate domain. I'm reading this very interesting book about Admiral Zange's expeditions, not just all the way into the Indian Ocean, but up to Venice, where, I don't know if this has been commissioned by Beijing, but the claim is that the European Renaissance really got kick-started by the arrival of these Chinese expeditionary ships into the Mediterranean. Also, while there was talk of the new international order in terms of the Chinese perception after Xi Jinping took over, there was no explicit reference to G2, although we have been talking about it. That's the elephant in the room. Is this something that, while we have protested when Obama made the mistake of incorporating it, that there's a certain inevitability about it? I think that's, again, a question that we need to ask. Obviously, it's not something that India would wish to accept as a norm for the region, but I think it is worth identifying. And finally, I suppose this is a historical irony that Germany, Japan, the so-called enemy powers, the defeated powers of World War II, have, in our time and in the course of our discussion today, as we saw, been referred to in terms of their contribution and their role to the economic resurgence of their respective continents. I think the dilemma of how to deal with Germany continues to vex Europe, and likewise the question that Subha raised about how dependable can Japan be considered, and should we be investing as much as we are in the relationship with Japan in terms of the dependability. I think these are some of the changes that we need to encounter, to anticipate, as we go about determining what our options are. Now, in the course of today's discussions, particularly in the first session, what struck me was that there was still this notion of how China would react to what Russia does, to what the United States does, to what India would or might not do, than that there should even be any discussion about whether China would be assertive. History has shown that every power that rises is assertive. And this was true of the United States, it was true of Russia, it was true of Britain. It is true of any power that has come to prominence all the way back to the Romans. So there's no question. Yes, China will be assertive. I think that is a norm. Given that, how are we going to deal with it? Many references this morning to what clarity of objectives China had. And perhaps this again is a pointer for the Indian discourse in terms of the need for clarity on objectives, going back to where we wish to position ourselves, as also thinking strategically and not culturally. And here I come to certain perceptions that we have of ourselves. I think the Indian identity and India's functioning today as a nation state really suffers from the fact that Indian civilization has prevailed for so many millennia, as a result of which the interests of this entity known as the Union of India that we function within tends to get watered down with the benefits of soft power, great as they are, with the fact that Indian culture has spread thus far, therefore if we are nice guys, the world will sort of take care of our interests. None of this really works in the hard world of today, where there have been references to essentially a rubric of the balance of power, of economic strength, of the need for India to get its act together, and thereby try to place itself strategically in this region in a manner that serves our interests. We raised two-strike cause, or at least are in the process of raising two-strike cause, and that has resulted in a huge amount of debate. And you contrast that, given the reference to Chinese clarity about its objectives, with its immense range of exercises, military exercises and deployment in Tibet, where there is no question of the national objective being called into question or doubt. And I don't think this necessarily has to do with democracy and another form of government, but with the nature of the communication that the government puts in place in terms of conveying to public opinion through strategic discourse, through think tanks, universities, and of course the media, about the pursuit of India's security interests in a particular area. Likewise, in terms of thinking of the military dimension of engagement in contemporary terms with the rest of Asia, both to our west and to our east, security, defense, all tend to raise a degree of nervousness in Indian thinking. I would be happy to send agricultural scientists, Kathakali troops, and such like. Again, the soft power approach. And many of us have often heard of this great need to pursue India's soft power. Because Joseph Nye wrote an article, it became a subject of discourse. It's all very well, but it's only provided you have the hard power to back it up. Soft power cannot and will not function on its own. And this is where I come to sometimes our own ambivalences. Some of the discussion this morning talked of what the US's expectations of India are. I think Arun had raised the point. And somebody said, well, the US wants India to be a security provider. But believe it or not, we have been security providers on our own, whether it was with regard to the tsunami, whether it was with regard to Sri Lanka in 1971, when Sirimao faced her JVP insurgency, Bangladesh, of course, Maldives, currently in a very active, systematic manner with Mauritius, with Seychelles. So it's not as though India does not have the ability to do it, but perhaps we would give ourselves greater clarity by forging this, by articulating it into some kind of a review, a doctrine. I've often talked of the need for a national security doctrine, but even a strategic doctrine in terms of what our Look East policy is all about would, I think, make a major difference. So we've talked about the world view. I think we need to determine, again, pursuing what Professor Muni talked about, what resources and what type of engagement shall be put in place. It's not just a question of the cultural linkages. The economic linkages, I think, come into play as well. When I went as ambassador to Thailand, I found that our scholarship scheme essentially went to Buddhist monks to study Pali grammar. Very good, soft power. But nobody came to India to study physics, IT, not even IT in those days, biochemistry, engineering, none of these areas. Of course, we get a lot of them from our so-called immediate neighbors, forgetting that Thailand and Indonesia are also immediate neighbors because we have maritime boundaries with them. Or when we started the process of putting FTAs into place. Again, we envied the rise of the East Asia tigers. We admired Japan for what it did. I used to handle trade on the west coast of the United States and took some time off to study what their approach was. But when the notion of putting FTAs into place in a very limited manner with some of India's neighbors and friends in this region was put forward, I can tell you that the internal diplomacy was much more difficult than the external diplomacy in terms of getting an acceptance of the idea put forward. At the military level, Professor Keshwan listed all the agreements that India has signed. But a lot of those are in the nature of bilateral cooperation agreements which involve comparatively anodyne activity like ships visits, exchange of chiefs, training, some sports exchanges, and such like. But in terms of perhaps joint operations, in terms of exchange of intelligence, in terms of equipment sourcing, I think these are the areas where we need to develop further. With regard to strategic positioning, and I think Admiral Vijay Shankar and Raja might remember this, when the Andaman and Nicobar command proposal was being put forward, and I think it is supported even to this day, there was a great sense of apology and defensiveness. That, well, actually, we aren't doing very much. We are merely trying to hoist a flag up over here, and it's an internal admin thing between Vizag and Port Blair and so on. Instead of saying we have vital interests out here in the middle of the Bay of Bengal. It's at the mouths of the Straits of Malacca. It's the route through the islands that take you to the heart of the Kra Isthmus, at which at one point a canal was being proposed, and so on. So strategic thinking, political thinking really would require much greater clarity on this. Now, this is a set of 6 replies to the points that had been raised. How does India perceive the region? I think it is still an evolving view, and Mohan's point of the enigma of a rival, I think we sometimes tend to be surprised that our neighbors in this part of Asia expect as much of us as they do, and that indeed there is the capacity to deliver. The Look East policy has to go beyond soft power to hard issues of trade, of investment, of manufacturing, and of ground-level connectivity, so that the actual link between India and East Asia runs from the westernmost port of Gujarat all the way up to Da Nang in the South China Sea. That will truly make it Indo-Pacific. What are the consequences of changing geopolitics in the region for India? We've already talked about it, but essentially, if India does not see itself as an active strategic participant with commitment of resources, of personnel, finances, and equipment, we will not be able to draw on the opportunities that are available. Again, Professor Muni talked of these opportunities. How far does the US pivot to the Asia-Pacific determine dynamics among India, China, Japan, and the other states in the region? I think that these dynamics are really independent of India, and it is for India to avail of the opportunities that these might provide. The China-US relationship, I think, exists on its own, And India's positioning of itself will really be based on its identification of its interests. To what extent would an alliance formation serve India's interests? I don't believe any alliance works equally for both partners, and a country the size of India has to recognize that at the worst of times it will be on its own, and that therefore requires us to develop all the capabilities that we need for this purpose. And how much of a threat from New Delhi's perspective is China's technological advancement in the Asia-Pacific region? I would like to refer you to a publication that the ORF has put out about science and technology in China. And I think that really indicates the need for India to strategize it. I was discussing with Professor Nagappa and Chandrasekhar over the break about the aeronautical industry and so on. And I would strongly urge NIAS to do an exercise with the National Manufacturing Competitiveness Council on this. Dr. V. Krishnamurthy has some very clear ideas on this particular aspect, and it's a good thing to encapsulate them sooner than later. A method by which China has functioned at multiple levels in breaching any structure that has been sought to be created in this particular part of the world. So India needs to build partnerships. India is too big for alliances. I don't believe we have the capacity to handle it, and nor would they work in our interests. And I think this ultimately is what I would like to say. It's a somewhat longer than a yes, sir, does not arise answer, but yes, I am done. Thank you.